Under the NEC, the primary mechanism for using the contract is through the submission and acceptance of the programme at regular intervals from the contractor to the project manager. John, what happens if the project manager doesn't accept or even acknowledge a programme that's been submitted? Is it accepted by default?
Well, contractually the answer is no. The recourse under the contract is that the contractor should notify a compensation event because the project manager hasn't done an obligation which they should have done under the contract. But I did say contractually the answer is no. Practically, let me play out the scenario and see what you think. So let's say the contractor submits their first programme. The project manager pays the first assessment, so they haven't used the quarter for price for work done to date sanction. So that implies that the programme contained all the information. Compensation event occurs. And the project manager instructs the contractor to submit quotations. And if there's no programme in place, except a programme in place, the project manager should be the one assessing compensation events. And let's say that in that programme, the employer has to supply 6 or 7 different things in the first month, and the employer supplies 5 of them, and then the big important one, which let's say is access to site, the 6th one, they don't do. And then the contractor says, well, actually, compensation rent because you haven't supplied what's in the programme. And the project manager turns around and goes, well, I never accepted your programme, therefore I don't have to supply it. Practically, I think if the contractor then went to adjudication, and adjudicators tend to look a little bit more at the fairness of the situation than take a purely legal stance, I think you'd be pretty unlucky as a contractor to have the adjudicator make a decision against you in those circumstances.
Ewan, how does that sit with you? Should there be a default acceptance provision if there's no answer, in the same way that there is in the compensation event mechanism, perhaps after a warning to the project manager that he hasn't complied, but there should be some way of getting to acceptance?
There should be. Whether an obligation to, or a deeming provision that the programme should be accepted, say after a certain period of time, I'm not persuaded either way at this moment in time. I'd like to see that the education, the improvement, say recognising clause 14 and that acceptance does not mean acceptance of liability, that would be helpful. So I don't think the project managers should be so fearful of accepting the programme, and it would help enormously if they did. But I'm not necessarily convinced at this stage that a deeming provision for the acceptance of the programme, which could contain errors just because, and it might be because the project manager doesn't feel he has the expertise to really understand it like the contractor. And I think matters like that, I would be slightly concerned if there was a deeming provision. But I can also see the benefit of it as well.
So, Ian, if we get into a situation where a contractor's making submissions monthly in accordance with the contract and the project manager simply isn't answering them, what should the contractor be doing?
Well, for me, an early warning could be raised at that point in time, and the contractor could, get the project manager to attend a meeting, a risk reduction meeting, to put this issue on the table and have a conversation around it, try and understand what is happening, what the reluctance is. Maybe try and get that education going both ways around what the programme's for, clause 14, etc. And again, as John's already mentioned, potentially you've got a compensation event to raise because the project manager is not complying with the timescales in the contract in terms of replying to communications. So you could say that there's issues around that. So there are ways to raise it, but unfortunately, I don't think the contractor can force the project manager to do their job. Ultimately, maybe they have to go beyond the project manager to the client organisation and say, your project manager on your behalf is not operating the contract properly to the detriment of both sides.
That's really interesting. So how practically, John, how could you achieve that? Actually getting, as contractor, going round the project manager to deal direct with the employer. Is there a mechanism in the contract to do that?
Well, not strictly speaking, but I do very much agree with the given early warning. Early warnings tend to be seen as technical problems, whereas actually they could be relationship problems, which again to impact on the price, etc., and so on. So, and raising it in that way where let's step out for a minute or two from actually the detail of operating the contract and just say, what's going on here? What's the dynamic? And are you aware, etc. So one is you just write a letter or phone up the employer, the project sponsor or whatever it is. I've done some, in the past I've done workshops where there have been problems of that sort of nature about why it wasn't being operated. And some of those are more training orientated to get about the NEC, but some of those are just pure facilitated workshops. They're problem solving and they're standing out from the day to day saying what's structurally going on. We have the knowledge of the contract, but it's not working. What's happening and what do we do about it?
So if I want to summarise that conversation, it's really the acceptance of the programme is clearly important. There isn't a contractual mechanism to force acceptance, and it's not clear whether that would actually be beneficial in the contract mechanism anyway. But if there is a problem with achieving acceptance of the programme, the key to success is to deal with that issue proactively, responsibly, and engage in a conversation about why that's happening, firstly with the project manager as the first port of call, and then onwards to the employer or others, engaging other mechanisms, whether it's training or taking some problems away from that process in order to allow that acceptance to start again. Because without the acceptance, a lot of the other processes in the contract start to fall apart. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.